President Trump's planned tariffs on Canada and Mexico may be on hold for now, but they may have exposed a weak spot in America's lumber industry. Kelly Saberi is taking a closer look.
Canada is the world's largest exporter of lumber, and the United States is majority source for the softwood that they use in home building. This product already has a 14.5% duty on it, implemented by the Biden administration back in August.
Recovered late morning. Lumber futures are, of course, higher given the news on the 25% tariff on Canada. There is already a 14.5% duty on Canadian lumber, so this will end up being a total of close to about 40%. Now, 1/3 of the lumber used in U.S. home building comes from Canada.
The White House says America didn't need Canadian lumber. They said U.S. sawmills could handle the load. They were wrong, and now Detroit is paying the price. On August 1st, 2025, the United States slapped a crippling 35% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber, blindsiding the construction industry and shattering the fragile post-COVID housing recovery. The justification? Protect American jobs, said Washington. But behind the camera-ready slogans was a deeper strategy and a dangerous gamble. A gamble that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney refused to play. In a press conference that caught even Ottawa off guard, Carney didn't plead. He didn't protest. He slammed the door shut. And with that single gesture, Canada set into motion a retaliatory plan that would unravel decades of North American supply chains and plunge cities like Detroit, already teetering, into economic chaos. What started as a lumber dispute has now snowballed into something far bigger, a cross-border confrontation threatening to ignite a consumer backlash, trade realignment, and inflation spiral. And yet, this isn't just about wood. It's about sovereignty, leverage, and what happens when America's protectionist policies finally meet a Canadian government ready and willing to fight back. This is the economic battle you weren't supposed to see. And it's just getting started. When Trump announced the 35% tariff, his language was designed for headlines, American wood for American homes. But behind the podium bluster was a dangerous oversight. The U.S. doesn't have enough lumber. Not now, not in 5 years. Since 2024, America has already been paying 14.54% more on Canadian softwood imports due to countervailing duties. Yet Canadian lumber still flowed south because U.S. builders simply had no choice. Over 30% of framing lumber used in American residential construction comes from Canada. And when that flow is hit with a 35% price wall, the impact is instant and brutal. The National Association of Home Builders estimates that every $1,000 increase in lumber costs adds roughly $4,500 to $6,000 to the final cost of a new home. With current projections, the August tariff could inflate home prices by $10,000 to $14,000 by 2027, especially in Midwestern cities already facing affordability crises like Detroit, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. This wasn't just a policy. It was a wrecking ball aimed at America's own domestic construction market. Canada's initial response was restrained, but strategic. The first signal came from British Columbia's Forestry Ministry, which warned that provincial mills would reevaluate their southern export obligations. That was code for, "We're ready to cut you off." Days later, Ontario's Economic Development Office confirmed it was reviewing export quotas, citing hostile trade actions from the United States. In other words, Carney's government didn't respond with rage. It responded with leverage. Meanwhile, U.S. production simply couldn't step up. Domestic sawmills, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, have been battered by labor shortages, environmental restrictions, and wildfire devastation. In fact, 2023 saw a 16% drop in output due to fire-related shutdowns across Oregon and Washington. And with Biden-era sustainability rules still active, even Trump's re-election couldn't fast-track new logging permits. The result? America is out of trees it can legally cut. And Carney knew it. By mid-July, Ottawa started sending quiet signals to Europe and Asia. Under CETA, Canada already enjoys tariff-free access to the EU. Under CPTPP, it can ship lumber directly to Japan, which has been investing in wooden architecture at a record pace. Both markets pay higher prices per cubic meter than the U.S., but have historically been undersupplied due to U.S. demand dominance. Not anymore. In a press release barely noticed by American media, Canada's trade minister announced a strategic reallocation of softwood exports to diversified, high-value markets. Translation: we're not just cutting you off, we're upgrading our buyers. This is more than just a trade reroute. It's a structural pivot, a rebalancing of decades-long economic ties. Instead of just shipping raw logs and 2x4s across the border, Canada is now focusing on value-added wood products. Things like cross-laminated timber, CLT, plywood panels, and treated architectural lumber, products that are less exposed to raw tariffs and more in demand globally. This tactic not only bypasses the U.S. tariff wall, it turns it into a competitive weakness. And the consequences were immediate. U.S. homebuilders warn of delivery delays. The National Retail Federation reported price spikes on imported furniture materials. And in Detroit, where housing starts had finally recovered post-COVID, several projects were abruptly put on hold due to cost overruns. But the damage wasn't just material. It was political. Republican governors in Michigan and Ohio, Trump's strongholds, began pushing back. One aide to Michigan's governor said privately, "We didn't sign up for a lumber war with our biggest neighbor." Meanwhile, Canadian officials, rather than escalating with nationalist rhetoric, quietly tightened the screws, restricting output, redirecting supply, and remaining eerily calm. This wasn't chaos. This was a coordinated squeeze. Even U.S. importers started to panic. Major wholesalers like 84 Lumber and Builders First Source began lobbying Congress for a temporary suspension or at least a waiver system for Canadian shipments. But the White House doubled down, claiming that any waiver would weaken America's hand. What Trump didn't anticipate was that Canada had already let go of the hand. And there was another quiet shockwave rippling beneath the surface. The trade war was starting to spread. Reports surfaced of steel mills in Alberta pausing exports to Illinois. Saskatchewan farmers were urging Ottawa to review grain shipments south, while Canadian unions called for cross-industry retaliation, particularly in consumer goods, automotive parts, and retail packaging. Canada wasn't just defending its lumber, it was preparing to unplug the entire cross-border ecosystem. And that's what made Carney's silence so devastating. While Trump shouted about sovereignty and American jobs, Carney said almost nothing. No grand speeches, no tweet storms. Just slow, methodical policy steps that let market forces punish the U.S. for its short-sighted tariff move. It was the geopolitical version of a chess master calmly repositioning every piece while the other side bangs the table. And in cities like Detroit, Buffalo, and Toledo, the fallout was just beginning. As the dust from the lumber tariffs settled, the real panic began, not in Washington, but in America's industrial heartland. In Detroit, construction firms began issuing warnings that the cost of framing alone had jumped 23% in a matter of weeks. One major developer paused work on a 400-unit housing project near Dearborn, citing unmanageable material volatility. In a region already battered by inflation, this wasn't just a setback. It was a systemic shock. But that was just the beginning. The tariff didn't just raise lumber prices, it ignited a chain reaction. Furniture manufacturers in North Carolina, who rely on Canadian hardwoods for frames and panels, began cutting shifts. Big box retailers like Lowe's and Home Depot saw supply contracts disrupted. The effect rippled outward, hammering jobs and delaying deliveries across multiple U.S. industries. And while the White House claimed short-term pain for long-term independence, Canada was flipping the script entirely. Carney's next move wasn't retaliatory, it was visionary. Rather than react emotionally to Trump's tariff war, Canada accelerated its internal transformation. It announced $3.1 billion in funding to modernize lumber processing in provinces like Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, focusing on high-margin engineered wood products. These aren't raw logs, they're structural components used in green buildings, skyscrapers, and earthquake-resistant infrastructure. Products, in other words, that America now desperately needed, but couldn't afford. This pivot had two major effects. First, it insulated Canadian producers from raw material tariffs. Engineered products often fall into separate trade classifications, many of which weren't covered under Trump's lumber war. That allowed Canadian firms to keep exporting to third-party U.S. buyers through indirect channels, or reroute to countries like Germany, Singapore, and even South Korea. Second, it made Canadian wood more valuable than ever, not just as a commodity, but as a strategic export asset. Suddenly, Canada wasn't the junior partner in a timber relationship, it was the global supplier with options. Meanwhile, U.S. officials scrambled to contain the fallout. A leaked memo from the U.S. Department of Commerce revealed internal warnings that the tariff could add 0.2% to core inflation by early 2026. That's enough to pressure the Federal Reserve, spook housing markets, and torpedo Trump's economic pitch ahead of the election. And in Canada, confidence surged. Polling showed over 63% of Canadians supported cutting off lumber exports to the U.S. if tariffs remained in place. Hashtags like #BuildWithFriends and #NotForTrump trended on social media as Canadian consumers began boycotting U.S. products. Everything from craft cheese to Ford pickups saw a measurable dip in sales across Canadian markets. This wasn't just about wood anymore. It was economic nationalism in full force. The trade war's expansion hit U.S. border towns hard. In Niagara Falls, New York, cross-border retail traffic dropped 28% in August alone as Canadians canceled shopping trips. Hotel bookings plummeted. Outlet malls saw weekend sales collapse. And in Buffalo, the local Chamber of Commerce issued a public plea. Let's not pay the price for a political stunt. But Canada had more than moral high ground. It had legal ammunition. Under the USMCA, trade partners are required to act in good faith and avoid discriminatory practices. Carney's legal team began preparing a formal challenge to the U.S. tariff hike, claiming it violated Article 10.8 on fair treatment and market access. The move could trigger an international arbitration panel by late 2025, just in time to disrupt Trump's re-election campaign narrative. And unlike past trade disputes, Canada wasn't coming to the table empty-handed. The federal government presented internal data showing that Canadian softwood producers were earning 20% more per unit from exports to Europe and Asia compared to the U.S. post-pivot. This wasn't a loss. It was an upgrade. And that data was quietly sent to Washington. It wasn't just economics. It was a message. We don't need you anymore. As pressure mounted, even Trump's allies in Congress began distancing themselves. Senators from construction-heavy states like Texas, Georgia, and Arizona demanded a reevaluation of the lumber tariff. One aide reportedly warned the White House, if this spreads to steel, we lose the Midwest. But by then, the damage had metastasized. Auto suppliers in Ontario hinted they may start bypassing U.S. buyers. Agricultural firms in Saskatchewan reduced seed shipments to southern markets. And Canadian mining companies began exploring new processing partnerships in the EU and India, signaling a possible shift away from the integrated North American industrial system that's defined the region for decades. The U.S. wasn't just being punished, it was being left behind. And yet, through all this upheaval, Prime Minister Carney remained largely silent. No gloating, no retaliation, just discipline and direction. One senior Canadian official put it bluntly in a background briefing, this isn't about revenge, it's about rebalancing. We've relied on America too long. Now we're building something better. And perhaps most alarmingly for the U.S., other countries were watching. By mid-August, both Japan and Germany reached out to Canadian trade officials to explore long-term lumber contracts. Vietnam and Malaysia, also CPTPP members, offered to fast-track import approvals for engineered Canadian products. In less than a month, Canada had turned a trade war into a trade renaissance. It was a quiet diplomatic earthquake, and America hadn't even noticed it was trembling. What began as a 35% tariff meant to project strength has now fractured a foundational supply chain, raised home prices, frozen construction projects, and set off a boycott that's bleeding across industries. Canada didn't respond with rage. It responded with a strategic, surgical counterstrike, one that outmaneuvered Washington economically, legally, and diplomatically. In doing so, Carney revealed something deeper. This wasn't just a dispute over timber. It was a referendum on North American dependency and whether Canada would remain bound to a volatile U.S. agenda or step onto the global stage as a sovereign trade power. Detroit was just the first to feel the shock. But if this continues, the real collapse won't be in lumber markets. It'll be in America's assumptions about leverage, loyalty, and leadership. And here's the haunting truth. Washington still thinks it's in control. But the markets have moved. The allies have noticed, and Canada has already walked away. So the question isn't whether this trade war will end. The question is, who will be left standing when it's over? If you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to subscribe, and comment below. Was this a smart move by Canada, or just the beginning of a bigger crisis?